Hello, and welcome to this mini lecture for international business on this open day. My name is Alan Muller, and I'm a professor of international management here at the University of Groningen, and I'm also the academic director of the Bachelor Program in International Business. It's my pleasure to have you here today, virtually, to host you for this venture into the classroom experience in the International Business Program. So, just to give you a little bit of an idea of what might happen in the classroom, might kick off with a pithy quote like this: "May you live in interesting times." Why would I say something like that? It's a message that seems to have a double connotation. On the one hand, interesting is good. On the other hand, interesting feels potentially negative. It's often presented as sort of a curse. I would say, in the world of international business, we live in very interesting times, and this makes the program all the more relevant to study. For instance, if we take a longer term perspective, we can look back and we can realize that for the past 30 years or so, we've lived with a pretty constant ideology, understanding of the way the global business system works. We've talked about this in terms of globalization. So, multinational companies operating ubiquitously around the world, selling products, purchasing inputs, and we've started to take this for granted. But recently, The Economist magazine, which is actually quite pro-globalization in terms of its ideological foundations, actually took a critical stance on this and said maybe we've gotten this wrong. Maybe we've put too much emphasis on the good sides, the upsides of globalization, and not paid enough attention to the downsides, to the risks. So they noticed that companies that operate internationally don't necessarily outperform companies that only do business domestically. So this raises the question of what kinds of challenges, what types of issues are international companies exposed to that we're not paying sufficient attention to. So you could think about recent developments in the form of trade wars, in the form of regional trade blocs being established instead of multilateral global level trade agreements. You could even think about the Brexit, which was part of the European Union, which was supposed to be a second track solution to international trade and investment, but then you have member states that are leaving the European Union. What does this tell us about the state of globalization? But that's not even thinking about more recent and potentially more urgent interesting events in international business. The corona pandemic. So this is a picture that I took at the airport some time ago, which of course was unthinkable a year ago, that we could be in a situation where there was no travel, where businesses had to entirely rethink their foundations. So we live in very interesting times, and if there ever was a time to study international business, I would say this is it. Since we're doing the classroom experience, I might kick off a class session with some newspaper articles, some practical examples of the types of dynamics or issues we'd be talking about in class. And one of the reasons I like to pull out newspaper articles is because I like to tell my students that I hope that by the end of the course, I'll have changed the way that they consume information. I'll have changed the way that they read the newspaper. That they'll read the newspaper and they'll see things they recognize from class and say, oh, I understand what's happening there because we talked about that in class. So, might kick off with a story like this, just about a random company, not trying to make anybody look bad, but Walmart, a US retailer, being fined to the tune of $282 million to settle claims of corrupt practices. So this comes about because they paid consultants in some of the emerging markets that they operate in to establish business connections for them. And you could say, well, in a lot of markets, that's a very normal thing to do. In this case, however, it's a US company, and paying such consultation fees, if you will, can constitute bribery. And US companies are subject to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, even for their overseas activities. So US companies can be fined because they engage in these behaviors, which might be considered normal in those contexts, and which companies from other countries might still be able to do. But in the US, it's illegal, even if it's done abroad. So this is an illustration of how the playing field is not level for companies, because companies from France or Germany are not subject to the same type of restrictions that a US company would be. Another example, McDonald's doing business in India. So they had a local partner, as is quite common. They found a local businessman with extensive ties and franchising experience and food industry experience. And this is how this then works. You give them a license to sell your products and to run stores on your behalf. And they, of course, have to abide by certain guidelines and restrictions and do things in a certain way. What happened in this particular case, maybe the local Indian partner somehow violated the terms of the agreement or wasn't acting in the spirit of the arrangement, or maybe changed the products available in the retail outlets. I don't know, but at the end of the day, McDonald's terminated that agreement and said, we no longer want to work with you. We're pulling out. But then the local partner says, well, I attach a lot of value to this McDonald's brand on my storefront, so I'm just going to leave it there. And then McDonald's is in a situation where they have to go to court and they have to fight to protect their intellectual property. And so there's an information asymmetry issue here where the local partner understands that there are certain opportunities that exist for them to take advantage of their trade partner. And at the end of the day, McDonald's had to buy this partner out. They had to pay them a lot of money in order to get them to stop violating the agreement. So these are some of the kinds of risks that companies face when they engage in international business. So international business is really about the unique challenges that companies face when they operate across borders. That there's a new set of challenges that make it especially different, and this is what the program international business is about, because companies buy and they sell and they source and they coordinate operations across multiple jurisdictions. And there are things that you think you know about doing business in those markets. There are things that you think you know. There are things you know that you don't know. So there's all kinds of ways in which you can get it wrong as a business when operating in foreign markets, because you make assumptions based on the things that you know. But there are often things you don't even know that you don't know. So another practical example, and this is a real life example, and it's not related to the product. This is just a stock photo. It's not related to the product on the screen. But this is about a real German company that produces an additive for laundry detergent, something that you throw in your washing machine to make your whites even whiter, something like that. Now, they had success at home, good product, high quality, effective, and they decided they want to expand their market. So they looked to China. China is a big marketplace, lots of people, lots of clothes that need washing. So let's see if we can expand into the Chinese market. So how do they do this? They find an online platform, very easy these days, an online platform through which they can try to distribute their product. So they do this. They set this up and they let it run. And initially there's an uptick in interest, so Chinese customers purchasing this laundry additive, this washing detergent additive, but sales drop off pretty quickly and remain really low for a long time. And they try to figure out why this is. They can't really understand why the Chinese customers are not so interested in their products. And of course, focus groups and things like that are a little bit different in that context because you don't always get a direct answer. If you ask someone, what do you think of the product? They might tell you they think it's amazing. But they're still not buying it. So why? So they racked their brains on this problem for almost 2 years until through just sort of random happenstance, they got a Chinese intern who was a student in Germany, and he took on an internship at this company. And of course, they pitched the problem to him. They said, we don't understand why this product's not taking off. So the Chinese student dives into the material to understand the product better and how it works. And at a certain point, he comes to the managers and he says, it says here in the product description that the enzyme reaction only occurs at water temperatures above 30 degrees. Is that true? Yes, that's correct, say the engineers. And the Chinese student says, but you know that the vast majority of washing machines in China operate on cold water, don't you? Something the managers had never thought about. Why was their product not selling? Because it didn't actually do anything in the cold water that is typical of the Chinese washing machine. Just to go to show that you can think about all manner of different issues that you have to face, how to distribute, how to price the product, how to communicate about its attributes, what government regulations you need to take into account, what other barriers you might need to circumvent, and then still something as simple as this you could overlook. Not because you should have known, it's just something that you never considered. Because in your world, washing machines run on hot water. So how to make sense of this? We are an academic educational program, so it's not just about practical examples, it's about taking academic research and theoretical frameworks and trying to make sense of of these types of dynamics. So this idea that people do things differently in different countries can be looked at in multiple angles, but one of the most important frameworks for thinking about this in the world of international business is the institutional theory. So institutional theory says that each society is governed by its own sets of rules that affect the decisions that we make, that our behavior is guided by both formal and informal sets of rules that exist in the country, and they affect our preferences. So, for instance, should we drive electric vehicles or should we continue driving internal combustion engine vehicles? So the government can enact policies, subsidies, or taxes, or things like that to affect the cost-benefit calculation that you have. Right? And some countries might be more advanced than others, and that's because they value this behavior more than others. But the reason for taking out those policies or enacting those policies is to affect your decision-making behavior. Taking out insurance or not. Right? So in different countries, maybe higher risk aversion leads to higher insurance enactment. So the Netherlands, for instance, is a country with a relatively high risk aversion, and therefore people tend to over-insure. You never know what the value of insurance is until the very end, right? If you take out health insurance, you only know at the end when you die what the actual costs associated with that insurance were and how much your actual healthcare expenditures were, and therefore whether it was a good idea. But of course, all kinds of things, both culturally and government regulation-wise, try to influence our behavior. Something also similar, waiting at a red light or not. So in some countries, it's quite normal. There's a red light, you look left, you look right, there's no cars coming, you just cross the street. But there are plenty of countries where that's frowned upon. And the other people waiting at the light will let you know. And so all these things affect the costs and benefits associated with certain behaviors. So in that particular situation, you might want to cross the street, but you feel the social disapproval around you, and that disincentivizes you from doing so. So which behaviors are valued, which norms and laws enforce them, differ from country to country. Of course, institutional theory then assumes that we are rational actors, that we think about these costs and benefits and we let them influence our decision making in this way. And it says that or assumes that we want to seek out rewards and avoid punishments. So we want to avoid social disapproval, we want to avoid fines. So this incentive structure idea is designed to create transparency and predictability. It should reduce this kind of uncertainty because we agree on certain behaviors, how they should be done, and therefore we make predictable situations, such as the red light, right? Red light versus green light. We all have a shared understanding of what that means. If mine is green, I get to go. Yours is red, you stop, right? So we agree on these sets of rules, and that keeps traffic flowing relatively smoothly, and that reduces transaction costs. So for businesses, institutions are about clarity. They're about creating predictability and reducing uncertainty. So for instance, if you create a contract with a business partner, there are certain stipulations in there that dictate how that agreement is supposed to go down. And if someone violates the agreement, you can take them to court and you can sue for damages and that type of thing. So there are rules in place to keep the transaction costs low. Now, one thing that's important about institutions is that they're supported by both formal and informal mechanisms. And I'll explain what that means. By using an example of sociological experiments from back in the day, when some sociologists trying to understand human behavior and why people do the things they do, put some chimpanzees in a cage, and in that cage they had a ladder. At the top of the ladder they put some bananas. Now, if you put a ladder with bananas in a cage with chimps, and the chimps are going to try to go up the ladder and get the bananas because they want to eat them. The scientists know this, so they have a hose at the ready. So every time a chimp tries to go up the ladder and grab the bananas, the scientists spray the whole crowd with cold water. Now, chimps don't like this, so they might try it a couple of iterations, but after a couple of tries, right, the hose has disincentivized the bananas for them, and so they just leave them alone. So the next stage of the experiment is to take one of those original chimps out of the cage and introduce a new chimp who has not yet experienced the hose. So what happens is, this new chimp surveys the situation, observes the ladder, observes the bananas, and makes a break for it. What happens is the other chimps pull him off the ladder, and they give him a good sound beating before he can get to the bananas. because they know what happens next. The new chimp doesn't understand, but the other 4 chimps, they know what happens next. So what do the scientists do? They take another one of the original chimps out of the cage and they put another new chimp in. So new chimp, again, surveys the situation, sees the bananas at the top of the ladder, makes a break for it. The other 4 chimps in the cage pull him off the ladder and start beating him up too. And what's interesting about this is that the other new chimp, the one who just got beat up, participates in this beating. Now you have to imagine that this chimp, the first new chimp, has no idea why he's beating up this other new chimp, except that that's what's happening in this cage. That's what everyone is doing. There's a disciplinary action taking place that says, stay away from those bananas on the ladder. So the scientists continue this experiment. They keep cycling out the original chimps who experienced the hose. And now there are only chimps in the cage who have never seen the hose. But at the end of the experiment, none of the chimps tries to touch the bananas at the top of the ladder. They just leave it alone. So this experiment is designed to illustrate that there are different mechanisms that guide our behavior. We're not chimps, but we're pretty close, right? So these 3 different pillars of institutions that were identified. One being what we call the regulative or formal institutional pillar. And in our world, this means that certain behaviors are written down, codified in law as being desirable or undesirable. There are explicit sanctions associated with it. In this particular experiment, we'd be talking about the hose. So you're obligated to do that. It's the law, and there are explicit punishments associated with violating that behavior. But there's also a normative component to guiding our behavior. So we don't only react in certain ways because the police are watching us. There are other mechanisms that guide our behavior. And one of them is social approval. We want the people around us to accept us. We want them to think that our behavior is appropriate for the situation. So if I don't behave in accordance with group code, then they won't accept me, and I want to be accepted. So this is where the social correction of being beat up by the other chimps comes into play. They're letting you know what the desired behavior is. And then the last one is the cognitive pillar, which is just sort of the internalized, deeper-seated mechanisms that guide our behavior that we no longer really even think about. So by the end of the experiment, if you were to ask the chimps if they could speak, what's the deal with the bananas? They wouldn't even really have an answer. They would say, well, that's just not what we do around here. We don't eat those bananas. We just leave them up there. And if you ask them why, they wouldn't really know. So different mechanisms that guide our behavior. There's how you behave when you think the police are watching. There's how you behave when other people are watching. And there's how you behave just when no one is watching, because that's how you were brought up to be. So 3 pillars of institutions help us understand why different ways of doing things in different countries create challenges for international businesses. So there were things happening in the Chinese market, in the Chinese context, that the German managers didn't even think to ask about. Because why would you? That's just not the way things are done. So we could talk about this particular case all the way through the program, which of course we don't. But if we did, in the course Introduction to International Business, which is a first-year course, you might talk about things like entry modes. How do you get your product into the Chinese market? Do you export directly? Do you set up local production in the Chinese environment? Do you find a local distributor to work on your behalf? So having a local distributor is fine because that person or that party better understands the local circumstances. On the other hand, you lose some control. You have to share some of the profits. So there are costs and benefits with each option. We might talk about marketing-related issues, such as what's the proper price point? Do you have to adapt the product to the particular context? Well, in this case, definitely, right? The enzymes only kick in above 30 degrees, so you would have to do something different to your product to make it successful. In cross-cultural management, second-year course, you might talk about the role of culture in interactions and managing relationships between companies. So if you're a manager from Germany, what types of things do you have to be aware of if you're interacting with managers from China? And then last but not least, international financial management in year 3. You might be thinking about exchange rate risk. So you're selling into the Chinese market in local currency and you denominate your own profits in euros. So what kind of exchange rate volatility exists in that relationship? And what type of financial instruments can you use to hedge against that type of risk? For instance, you can go to a bank and you can take out a loan, or you can also go to a bank and you can sign a forward contract, which basically says that you will lock in an exchange rate at a certain time in the future to reduce that volatility. Because normally when you sell into a market, you don't get paid by the distributor for 3 months, maybe 6 months, sometimes even longer. Because the distributors don't have cash on hand to pay you. They need to earn the revenues from the sales before they can pay you back. So if it's going to take 6 months before you get paid, you have no idea what the exchange rate's going to be then. You can go to a bank and you can lock in an exchange rate today for a time at 6 months into the future. So the point being that in international business, there's a liability associated with being an outsider. We call this the liability of foreignness, that being a foreign entrant into a market means you come at an inherent disadvantage because there are things that the local parties know that you don't know, and there are costs involved in trying to acquire that knowledge, figuring out how things work. So if you think about the new chimp in the cage, he had to take a beating to understand what the rule in that cage was. So that was the cost that new entrant incurred. That was his liability of foreignness. So if you're an outsider coming in and you face this inherent disadvantage, then the study of international business is very much about understanding the nature of those disadvantages, but also thinking about strategies and opportunities that you can avail yourself of to circumvent those risks. So how do you overcome the liability of foreignness when engaged in international business? And that's really what the study is about. And if you'd like to know more, then I, of course, encourage you to apply and join our program. And for now, thanks for your attention. All the best.